Do you have any idea whose legacy you think you're holding?
Every secret has a lock, and every locked door eventually finds its key. The truth doesn't just reveal itself, it arrives to demand a reckoning. The ballroom at the Sterling estate didn't just shimmer. It groaned under the weight of excessive opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, casting a cold, artificial light over the city's elite. Champagne flowed. Laughter, brittle and practiced, filled the air. Elena Vance moved through the crowd like a shadow. Her uniform was crisp black and perfectly tailored to be invisible. That was the point. For 7 years she had been a ghost in this house, where the machined her eyes down, her back straight, and her thoughts locked behind a door that only she knew how to open. Tonight was the 50th anniversary gala of Sterling Media. It was Julian Sterling's night. He stood at the center of the room, looking every bit the ruthless prince of industry. At 45, Julian was polished, sharp, and utterly devoid of anything that couldn't be quantified in a balance sheet. He was holding a stack of vellum documents, the original last will and testament of his father, the late Arthur Sterling. Elena approached with a silver tray. Her feet, tired from 14 hours on the marble floors, felt like lead. She needed to place the crystal flute on the side table, but the crowd surged. Someone shoved. A waiter clipped her shoulder. Time didn't stop, but it seemed to hold its breath. Her foot caught on the edge of the plush Persian rug. She stumbled. The tray tilted. A single dark red drop of vintaged Pinot Noir leaped from the flute. Arching through the air like a tiny crimson comet, it landed right on the center of the vellum, a stain, deep, spreading, ugly. The ballroom didn't just go silent. It died. Julian looked down. For a heartbeat there was nothing, just the sight of that dark blotch consuming his father's legacy. Then his head snapped up. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were suddenly burning with a raw, primal rage. He didn't yell. He didn't ask what happened. Julian closed the distance in 2 strides. His hand moved faster than thought, a blur of motion that sliced through the stillness of the room. Crack. The sound was sickening. It echoed off the high ceilings, sharp as a gunshot. Elena's head whipped to the side. The impact sent her reeling, and she collapsed against the mahogany table. The tray clattered to the floor, silver hitting marble with a frantic, metallic ringing that seemed to last forever. Pain blossomed across her cheek, hot, throbbing, and electric. She tasted the sharp, metallic tang of blood in her mouth. "You clumsy, worthless piece of filth," Julian hissed. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a jagged blade. "Do you have any idea what you just ruined? That document is worth more than your entire miserable existence." Nobody moved. The socialites, the board members, the high-priced lawyers, they all stood frozen, clutching their drinks like shields. They looked at Elena, then at Julian, then back at their own shoes. They knew the rules. Power in this room wasn't about being right. It was about being Sterling. Elena slowly pushed herself up. Her hair was disheveled, a few strands clinging to the dampness on her cheek. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply reached up with a steady hand and wiped the blood from her lip. She turned. Her gaze met Julian's. It wasn't the look of a servant. It was the look of someone who had seen behind the curtain. It was cold. It was terrifyingly calm. The guests leaned in. They waited for her to apologize. They waited for her to beg for her job, to grovel in the way they expected a nobody to grovel. Elena stood tall. She ignored the sting in her skin. She ignored the audience. She spoke, and her voice, low, steady, and vibrating with an authority that didn't belong to a housekeeper, made the air grow thin. "You think you're holding a fortune, Julian?" She took a step toward him. He actually flinched, a microscopic retreat that no one else saw, but she did. "You're just holding paper," she whispered, the words drifting across the open, terrified space. "And you have no idea that the legacy you're so proud of, it's not yours. It was never yours. And after tonight, the world is finally going to learn exactly who you really are." The ballroom remained silent. But this time, it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a clock, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. Julian's face drained of color. He stood there, the stained paper trembling in his grip, staring at the woman he had just struck. For the first time in his life, he didn't look like a king. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a grave he had dug for himself. The silence that blanketed the ballroom after Elena left wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a vacuum. It felt heavy, suffocating. The kind of stillness that settles in a room right before a floor collapses. Where Julian Sterling stood motionless, a rigid silhouette against the shimmering gold-leaf walls. His right hand, the one that had met the softness of Elena's cheek with such brutal force, still felt cold, as if the skin had been numbed by the sheer arrogance of his own action. He stared down at the vellum document, his father's last will and testament, now ruined by an ugly, spreading blotch of vintage Pinot Noir. The wine looked like a jagged where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. He didn't look at his guests. He didn't look at the elite faces that usually fed his ego. He looked at the exit where the help had just vanished, her back straight, her stride purposeful. She hadn't looked like a servant. For those few seconds, she had looked like a judge delivering a final verdict. Worthless, he hissed. The word tasted like ash. It lacked the sharp, biting edge he usually commanded. It sounded hollow, like the echo of a man standing in an empty cathedral. With a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand, he cleared the room. He didn't want their shocked stares. He didn't want their polite, terrified questions. He needed to be alone. He needed to burn that image, the wine, the stain, the look in her eyes, out of his psyche. He turned on his heel and retreated to his private study, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him with a finality that rattled the crystal decanters on the sideboard. But sleep was a distant luxury. The image of Elena's eyes, burning with a calm, terrifying intelligence, flickered in the darkness like a persistent flame. The legacy you're so proud of? It's not yours. It was never yours. Julian paced the floor. His boots clicked rhythmically against the hardwood, a frantic metronome. He poured a glass of scotch, his hand trembling just enough to make the ice shiver against the glass. He had to know who she was. How did a woman who spent her days polishing silver and scrubbing floors know the secrets of the Sterling bloodline? The question gnawed at him, a splinter of doubt buried deep in his pride. He began to tear through the study, throwing files, legal briefs, and corporate strategy plans across the room in a blind, aristocratic rage. Then he felt a weight in his pocket. Something hard and cold. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a key, a heavy antique brass thing, ornate and intricate, clearly crafted by a jeweler who had long since turned to dust. It didn't belong in a modern suit pocket. Where the machines rattled the floor, he froze. He didn't remember putting this in his pocket. Then, the memory hit him, a flash of movement when he had shoved her back against the table. She must have dropped it, and he must have scooped it up in his anger. Why did a housekeeper have a key to the inner sanctum of the Sterling estate? His heartbeat accelerated, a fast, thudding rhythm in his ears. Julian sprinted toward the library, the heart of the house, where his father, Arthur Sterling, had sequestered himself for the last decade of his life. The room was a sprawling maze of towering mahogany shelves, filled with books that smelled of ozone and fading ink. He stared at the key in his palm. It looked hungry, waiting for a lock. He moved along the walls, his fingers grazing the leather spines. He felt like a ghost hunting for his own origin. He tried the secret compartments behind the heavy tomes. Nothing. He shifted a massive volume of Dante's Inferno, and then, as he pressed against the hidden wood paneling behind it, he felt a slight resistance. Click. The mechanism was primitive but ingenious. A section of the wall groaned, protesting against years of neglect, and swung inward. A narrow, dark passage yawned open before him. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the flashlight cutting a bright, intrusive beam into the gloom. He stepped inside. The air in here was different, still, cool, and thick with the smell of old paper and piano oil. This wasn't a bank vault. It wasn't a place for money or secret offshore accounts. It was a temple of sound. Stacks of sheet music were piled everywhere, reaching toward the ceiling like paper stalagmites. Where the machine was unmistakable, elegant, rhythmic, and frantic. Julian reached out, his fingers brushing the edges of the pages. He picked up a manuscript. It was a symphony, a haunting, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, complex arrangement of notes that looked like it had been composed in the throes of a fever. He scanned to the bottom of the page, expecting to see his father's name in the bold, practiced stroke he had seen on every Sterling contract for 20 years. Instead, he saw a signature he had seen on payroll receipts. Elena. His skin turned to ice. He scrambled through the stack, his movements becoming more desperate with every passing second. concertos, sonatas, operettas, each one more brilliant than the last. He found notes tucked into the folds, his father's handwriting scrawled in the margins of Elena's work. Elena, the melody is yours, the genius is yours, but the world will only listen if the name on the score is mine. Be patient. One day, I will make it right. Julian collapsed. He fell to his knees in the dust, the pages scattering around him like autumn leaves. Everything he was, the billionaire CEO, the genius visionary, the man who commanded the industry, was a house of cards built on a foundation of stolen genius. He wasn't the son of a titan. He was the son of a parasite. His father hadn't been a visionary. He had been a thief who had fed on the soul of a woman who had been silenced by the very house that now treated her like a non-entity. He found a folder tucked beneath a piano bench. He opened it and saw a photograph, a much younger Elena, sitting at a baby grand, her eyes bright with a spark of creativity that Julian had never seen in anyone in his entire life. Beside her stood his father, his hand gripping her shoulder with a terrifying, possessive squeeze. It wasn't love, it was control. It was the crushing weight of a man who knew he was nothing without the woman he had buried. A shiver of absolute terror rolled through Julian's marrow. He realized that Elena wasn't just a housekeeper. She was a silent observer, a witness to the fraud that had allowed his family to own the world. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, she had been living in the shadows of the mansion, watching him grow up, watching the empire expand on her own melodies, and waiting for the right moment to strike. He looked at his phone, his hand hovering over the contact for his legal team. He had to destroy this. He had to set it on fire, burn the house down, erase the evidence. But his hand was paralyzed. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, he looked and felt the weight of the notes, the music, the stolen years screaming at him from the walls. He knew with a sudden, sinking dread that even if he turned this room into ash, the truth was already out. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, the slap he had delivered to her face in the ballroom hadn't been an act of surrender. He had slapped the only person on earth who held the keys to his undoing. The house outside was wrapped in the silence of midnight, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. But here in the hidden room, the air felt alive. The music seemed to rise up from the piles of paper, a crescendo of truth that was finally, after 20 long years, ready to be played for the world. Julian Sterling knelt in the dark, the king of nothing, as the sound of the house he thought he owned began to tear itself apart. Julian stood paralyzed in the center of the hidden music room, his breathing labored and ragged. His flashlight beam swept over piles of manuscripts, smudged ink, and his father's frantic, scribbled notes. He couldn't believe his eyes. Every belief he held about his legacy, about the greatness of the Sterling name. It was all collapsing like a house of cards. The secret door creaked open. Elena walked in. She no longer bore the submissive, quiet demeanor of a housekeeper. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her face as still as a frozen lake, yet her eyes reflected a fire Julian had never seen before. "Found it then?" Elena's voice was low, strangely calm. Julian spun around, his face deathly pale, his hand gripping the symphony manuscript so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What is this? Did you stage all of this? You're a fraud! My father couldn't have done these things." Elena stepped forward. She showed no fear of the billionaire's rage. She stopped under the dim, flickering light and stared directly at Julian. "A fraud? You call this a fraud? Julian, look at these pages. Look at the brush strokes. Look at the intervals. Look at the soul within these melodies. Your father never wrote a single complete bar of music in his life. He was just a tone-deaf man with boundless ambition, and I was the one who provided everything he needed to build this flashy media empire." "Shut up!" Julian roared. He lunged at her, intending to grab her by the collar, but she sidestepped him with a grace that was almost supernatural. "He bribed my family when I was just a poor student," Elena continued, her voice echoing in the small room like a painful prayer. "He stole my talent, stole my freedom, and worst of all, he stole my name. He forced me to sign silence agreements, threatening to destroy the only people I loved if I dared to speak a word. And for 20 years I had to watch him stand on stages, receiving applause and prestigious awards, while I, the one who actually created it all, was just a shadow in this house." Julian retreated, colliding with the bookshelf. His mind was spinning. The truth was too grotesque to accept. He had spent his entire life idolizing a great man, a musical genius, only to realize he was the son of a coward, a petty art thief. "Don't lie to me." Julian hissed through gritted teeth. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. I have an army of lawyers. I hold the media machine in my hand. If I want to, I can paint you as a lunatic, a wandering madwoman making up stories to blackmail the Sterling family. Elena smiled, a cold, hollow smile filled with disdain. Do you think you still hold that power? Julian, you're so naive. Do you think that during the 20 years I spent in your father's shadow I did nothing but serve? Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. Every time your father signed his name to my work, I left a fingerprint. The original master recordings, the letters he wrote me in moments of weakness, the evidence of his orchestration. I sent it all to independent journalists and your corporation's most formidable competitors. Julian went silent, where the machines rattled the floor on the floor, frantically scrolling through social media and news outlets. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The company's stock was fluctuating violently, already, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. Newspapers were beginning to origins of the works that had made Arthur Sterling's name. You want to protect that tattered honor? Elena stepped closer, picking up a manuscript and caressing it like a child. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. You can burn this room to keep this papers, but you cannot burn the truth that has already begun to spread. The world will know. The whole world will know that the empire you hold was built upon the stolen soul of a woman. Julian looked at her, his eyes now filled only with desperation. He understood that the pawn he thought he held had become a ticking time bomb. He had lost all leverage. Elena, the housekeeper he had despised, was now the one holding the fate of the Sterling name. Why? Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why did you endure it for 20 years? Why didn't you end it all sooner? Elena looked him in the eye, and there was no hatred left in her gaze, only a terrifying serenity. Because I wanted to see who you would become, without the title of the genius's son. And now that I've seen your true face, I know it's time for this symphony to end. You are no longer the heir to an empire, Julian. You are merely the heir to the ruins your father left behind. Julian Sterling, the man who once made the business world tremble, was now nothing more than a man kneeling amidst a pile of paper. He understood that the truth hadn't just shattered his reputation. It had destroyed the very core of his identity. The horror wasn't in the loss of wealth, but in the realization that he had never truly existed without the stolen melodies of this woman. Outside, the rain began to fall. The sound of rain drumming against the library window was like a frantic beat, signaling a storm that Julian Sterling could never survive. The real war had begun, and he had nowhere left to hide. Here is the English translation of Part 4. Psychological Warfare and Preparation, written with the dramatic intensity and emotional pacing of the story, The Buried Symphony. Part 4. Psychological Warfare and Preparation. Xuan Tum Livasui Xuan. B. The rain outside did not let up. It hammered against the glass panes like a relentless rhythmic reminder of a coming execution. Inside the study, only two people remained. Julian Sterling, a man who only hours ago had held absolute, unquestioned power, and a chaotic sea of papers scattered across the hardwood floor. He stared at Elena's manuscripts. They were no longer just musical notes. They were blades cutting straight through the facade of the legacy he had spent his entire life curating. Julian realized he was trapped in a war where he held no high ground. He began making frantic, desperate calls. His personal lawyers, top-tier newspaper editors, influential members of the board, all received his frantic outreach, but met him with cold clipped tones and polite refusals, or worse, a heavy, suspicious silence, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. The rumors that Sterling media plagiarism were already spreading through the upper echelons of society like a virus. Stock prices began a downward spiral, red numbers dancing across his monitors like mocking ghosts. On the other side of the mansion, in the small, modest room at the end of the staff hallway, Elena sat in wait. Everything around her was unnervingly still. She was not rushing. In her hands lay a vintage digital recorder, the weapon she had guarded for 15 long years. She played back the audio. Arthur Sterling's voice, Julian's father, filled the room. It lacked the grandiose, booming confidence he projected on television. Instead, it was tremulous, calculated, and riddled with the cowardly remorse of a man fueled by drink. Elena, if you speak out, they'll kill us both. Just let me be the face of it. I'll provide you with the life you deserve. Elena smiled a bitter, thin smile. She had given him that chance. She had remained silent because she had once believed in the promises, where the machine who was her entire world. But when Arthur passed away, she realized she was nothing more than property being passed from father to son. Julian was no different. He viewed her as a slave, a ghost, a tool to flaunt his opulence. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, she began drafting an email. It was an open letter addressed to the city's largest news organizations. She attached the original manuscripts, the handwritten proofs, and the high-fidelity recordings. She knew that once that send button was clicked, her life would never be the same. But she felt no fear. Freedom, she realized, did not come from wealth. It came from the right to reclaim one's own voice. Just then, the door swung open. Julian strode in. He looked ravaged. His eyes were bloodshot, his designer suit rumpled and stained. The composure of a CEO was gone. He looked like a man starving to death, desperate to keep his grip on his dwindling power. "What are you doing?" Julian roared, lunging toward Elena's laptop. Elena did not flinch. She stood calmly, blocking his path. "I am doing what I should have done 15 years ago, Julian. I am setting myself free." Julian fell to his knees. He did not kneel to apologize. He knelt to bargain. "Elena, I'm begging you. I have money. I have so much money. How much do you want? 10 million? 50? You can leave this place tonight. Go anywhere on earth. Just delete it all. Leave the Sterling name alone. If this name collapses, I'm finished. I'll be ruined." Elena looked down at the man groveling at her feet. The sight was absurd. A billionaire, a man of supposed stature, begging for the silence of a housekeeper. "Where the machines rattled the floor until ruined. You ruined my life the moment you struck me in front of those people. You ruined my self-respect. Every single day you treated me like a piece of inanimate furniture. Your ruin isn't my doing, Julian. It's the consequence of every choice you've ever made." "You're a devil!" Julian screamed, springing to his feet, his hands balled into fists, ready for violence. But before he could touch her, a group of board members, whom Elena had quietly invited hours prior, stood waiting at the edge of the hallway. They witnessed everything. They saw Julian writhing in desperation. They saw the unnerving, steely calm of the woman they had long mistaken for a mere servant. "Julian Sterling," one of the board members said, their voice dripping with authority. "We have questions that require answers regarding the origins of your father's musical legacy, and it seems we don't need to look very far to find them." Julian Sterling's world began to shrink. The gates of glory were slamming shut in his face. He stood there, flanked by the disdainful glares of his former partners and the serene, untouchable gaze of Elena, the woman he had underestimated so gravely that he had paid with his entire career. Elena gently clicked, "Send." A soft click echoed through the room, but to Julian it sounded like the gunshot that ended the Sterling dynasty. The psychological war was over, and Elena had won, not with swords, but with the raw, crushing power of the truth. The 50th anniversary celebration of Sterling Media finally arrived. It wasn't a festival, it was a funeral for deception. The Sterling mansion was draped in opulent floral arrangements and crystal light, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight. Hundreds of large elites and the company's largest stakeholders were all in attendance. Julian Sterling, in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a year, stood on the podium. He surveyed the crowd, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, despite the hollow, sunken look in his eyes from sleepless nights. But just as Julian prepared to deliver his rehearsed speech about his father's legacy, where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, the fats of Ely screened to life. It wasn't a portrait of Arthur Sterling, nor was it a chart of record-breaking revenue. On the screen played the security footage from the charity gala the previous week. It was crystal clear. The sharp crack of a slap, Julian's twisted, cruel face, and the degrading insults he had hurled at the housekeeper. A gasp rippled through the auditorium. Whispers spread like wildfire. Julian stood rooted to the spot, his complexion cycling from pale to deathly gray. He signaled frantically to the technicians, but it was useless. The screen cut again. This time it displayed the original manuscripts, the possessive scribbles of his father, and finally, the audio recording. "Elena, this melody is yours, but the world will only listen if it comes from my name." Arthur Sterling's voice filled the cavernous hall, clear, distinct, and dripping with guilt. It was irrefutable evidence. The truth was laid bare under the harsh light of the very anniversary Julian had hoped to use to cement his power. Elena stood in the wings, watching. She didn't need to take the stage. She didn't need to argue. The truth, where the machine, its own inexorable weight, was doing all the work of crushing her enemy. She saw Julian on the podium, the man who had treated her like a piece of furniture, stumbling like a drunkard. He tried to speak into the microphone, but his justifications were drowned out by the boos of shareholders and the relentless flashing of cameras. Sterling is a fraud. He stole his legacy. The headlines were already flooding online news outlets. Sterling Media's stock wasn't just dropping, it was evaporating. Down 10 points, 20, then 50. The board members had been ready. They didn't wait for his speech to finish. They climbed onto the podium, not to congratulate him, but to strip his rattled the floor then and there. Security escorted Julian off the stage. He moved through the crowd, ignored or met with glares of contempt by the very people who had once fawned over him. He caught sight of Elena in the aisle, quiet and serene. He tried to lunge toward her, to hiss one final threat, but Elena's gaze stopped him cold. There was no hatred in her eyes, only pity. The pity one feels for a man who never knew who he was without borrowed light. Everything that followed moved like a whirlwind. Julian Sterling didn't just lose his CEO title. He was detained by authorities to face an investigation into fraud and financial crimes related to the stolen legacy that had spanned decades. Sterling Media crumbled, paving the way for a new era of transparency. 2 weeks later, in a small concert hall in the city center, a special piano recital was held. It wasn't ticketed, yet it was packed with talented musicians and genuine lovers of art. Elena Vance stepped onto the stage. She was no longer wearing the somber, where the machines rattled the floor of a housekeeper. She wore a gentle blue dress, her step light and confident. She sat at the polished grand piano and placed her thin, graceful fingers upon the ivory keys. Where the machines rattled the floor into swell, the symphony she had written in those long, lonely nights, the masterpiece that the Sterling family had deliberately buried in the dark, was finally taking flight under the stage lights. It was no longer the asset of an empire. It belonged to her, and to those who knew how to cherish the beauty of the truth. In the audience, former victims, those who had been deprived of their rights, and those who had helped her expose the lies, sat with bated breath. The music wasn't just sound, it was a declaration of freedom, a justice reclaimed after 20 long years. Behind the stage, as the concert closed to a thunderous, standing ovation, Elena smiled softly. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, nor did she harbor resentment for Julian Sterling, who was paying the price for his choices behind bars. Where the machines rattled the floor until midnight, they were still there, strong and full of life. Life is not a symphony pre-written by someone else. Life is the notes you must write with your own hands. Her symphony had finally been played in its entirety, echoing into the expanse, a living testament. No darkness can ever permanently shroud the light of the truth. Elena exited the concert hall and stepped into the city street at dusk. She did not look back. Behind her, the deception had turned to ash. Before her, a new journey, her own journey, was truly beginning, a new symphony, authentic and filled with pride.